The road to Belanglo winds like a serpent through the southern highlands of New South Wales, carved into dense woodlands where the trees grow so thick they choke out the sun. In the early 1990s, it was a place few outside Australia had ever heard of. Just another forest, just another stretch of land where people went camping, hiking, or sometimes just to be alone. But that silence, that raw, green quiet, was the perfect cover for what Ivan MIlat needed. It was the perfect place to make someone disappear. He looked ordinary. Thick, dark hair combed carefully to the side, muscular arms from a life spent laboring with his hands. He drove a beat-up Holden panel van and knew the highways and back roads of New South Wales like the back of his calloused fingers. If you passed him in a petrol station, you wouldn't look twice. If he offered you a ride, you might even say yes. That's what his victims did. Backpackers, mostly foreign. Young people hitchhiking along the Hume Highway, looking to see the real Australia. Hostels, rainforests, cities, coastlines. It was the 90s, and hitchhiking still seemed safe. That's how Gabor Neugebauer and Anja Habschied vanished in late 1991. A German couple traveling together, last seen on their way to Darwin. They never made it. Their parents waited for calls that didn't come. The Australian Federal Police filed reports, marked them missing, and quietly moved on. But the forest didn't forget. By 1992, Belanglo had become a burial ground. Not that anyone knew it yet. Not until a man named Bruce Pryor was out there walking his dogs in September. He noticed something. Bones. Not animal bones. Something about the shape, the color. Human. The police arrived, fanned out through the scrub, and within hours the scene was locked down. What they found was a shallow grave, female, bound, clothing nearby, half buried beneath twigs and leaf litter. A few meters away, another body, Deborah Everest and James Gibson, two Australian teenagers who'd gone missing in 1989. No leads, no suspects. And now, years later, here they were, lying in the dirt, side by side. One had been stabbed so violently that his spine was punctured. The girl's skull was fractured. Their deaths had been slow, painful, personal. This was no accident. This was no robbery gone wrong. This was methodical. Investigators expanded the search. Belanglo State Forest was no longer just a forest. It was a crime scene. In October 1993, a few weeks after the discovery of the first grave, police found the remains of German nationals Simone Schmidl and Gabor Neugebauer. Then Anja Habschied. Her head had been severed. Her spine showed marks of repeated slashes. These weren't quick killings. They were deliberate, slow, precise. Some were shot, others stabbed, some both. All were restrained. Many had ligature marks, suggesting rope or wire. Several had been blindfolded. There was no attempt to hide them well, just enough soil to mask the smell. The killer didn't care if they were found eventually. He was buying time, not erasing evidence. The public reaction was immediate. Panic, fear. Backpackers stopped thumbing rides. Hostels put up warning signs. Parents overseas begged their children to come home. The term backpacker murders hit every headline from Sydney to Berlin. Australia's reputation as a laid-back, friendly travel destination was stained overnight. And the killer was still out there. Police had little to go on, but they had patterns. The choice of victims, mostly foreign, all traveling alone or in pairs, last seen near the same stretch of highway. The method, calculated, controlled. And something else? Guns. Forensics showed that at least one murder weapon was a Ruger 1022, a semi-automatic rifle popular with Australian hunters. That was a start. They began reviewing gun licenses, cross-checking with locals who lived near the forest. They looked at known offenders, men with violent pasts. But one name kept floating back to the top: Ivan MIlat. He had a criminal record: theft, assault. He lived close enough to the forest, owned a panel van, had firearms, and most importantly, he matched the description given by Paul Onions, a British backpacker who'd escaped. Back in 1990, Paul had been hitchhiking south of Sydney when a man named Bill picked him up. Seemed nice enough at first. They chatted, laughed, but then the mood shifted. The driver got quiet. Then he pulled off the road, said he needed to grab something from under the seat. That something was a gun. Paul ran, out the door, across the bush, zigzagging through scrub while bullets tore past his ears. He flagged down a car, dove in, and didn't stop running until he reached the British Embassy. His report went into a drawer. No action taken. Not then. Now, with bodies piling up in Belanglo, his story was golden. When detectives showed Paul a photo lineup, he picked out Ivan MIlat without hesitation. That was the man who tried to kill him. There was no doubt. Police had enough to move. On May 22, 1994, they raided MIlat's home. Inside they found weapons, camping gear belonging to victims, foreign currency, and a cache of items linked to the murders. A map of Belanglo with handwritten notes. A Ruger 1022. Items stolen from dead backpackers. MIlat was arrested on the spot. At trial, the evidence was damning. Paul Onions testified. Forensics matched the rifle, the van, the ropes. Witnesses described Ivan's obsession with control. One even said he talked about hunting people, not animals. The jury took little time. Guilty. 7 counts of murder. Sentenced to life without parole. Ivan MIlat never confessed, not once. He maintained his innocence until the day he died. But the evidence, physical, circumstantial, testimonial, left no doubt. The backpacker murders shook Australia to its core. They changed how the country saw itself, how it treated its young travelers. And in the stillness of Belanglo, where the trees once hid unspeakable violence, silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence, a haunted one, because long after Ivan MIlat was locked away, the forest still remembered, and so did everyone else. The courtroom was packed. Press from every corner of Australia filled the wooden benches, shoulder to shoulder, pens poised, tape recorders whirring. The public had turned Ivan MIlat into a household name, a symbol of a darkness they hadn't thought could exist in their own backyard. But beneath the headlines and the sound bites, there was something more chilling happening. This wasn't just a trial. It was the slow, deliberate unraveling of a man who had hidden his true self for years behind a smile, a handshake, and a job well done. He sat in the dock, unflinching, black hair neatly parted, button-up shirt ironed. You wouldn't think he was capable of killing one person, let alone 7. He glanced casually at the crowd, occasionally flashing the faintest smirk when a particularly gruesome piece of evidence was read aloud. Some said he looked proud. Others thought he looked bored. But no one thought he looked sorry. To understand Ivan MIlat is to understand control, the obsession with it, the absolute need to dominate. Each of his murders followed a disturbingly similar blueprint, one crafted not out of rage, but out of calculation. He didn't just kill, he prepared, he staged, he experimented. He hunted solo travelers or pairs, almost always backpackers, almost always hitchhiking along the Hume Highway, and preferably those who wouldn't be immediately missed. He offered a ride, played the helpful Aussie, then drove them deep into Belanglo State Forest. Somewhere off the main road, where tree cover blanketed the sky and wildlife drowned out screams, that's where the games began. Victims were often restrained, tied at the wrists and ankles, some blindfolded, some gagged. The bindings were consistent, nylon cords, sometimes wire. These weren't impulsive abductions. He brought his tools. He came ready. For some, the end was swift, a single shot. For others, it was anything but. One victim had been stabbed so many times the blade marks scored bone. Another had been shot multiple times, each bullet delivered with military precision. Yet another had their spinal cord severed, not in a fit of rage, but as if by someone studying anatomy. Two were decapitated. Forensic experts said it was likely done post-mortem. Another layer of dehumanization, another symbol of control. Items were often stolen, but not for value. Watches, shirts, small trinkets, souvenirs. One woman's gag had been made from the strap of her own backpack. One victim had their pants replaced with another's, as if Milat was mixing identities, blurring personhood. All of it suggested he wasn't just trying to kill, he was trying to erase. Police later found that some victims were kept alive for extended periods. The positions of the remains, the condition of their clothing, and traces of food in their digestive systems indicated hours, maybe even days, between capture and death. That meant Milat watched them, spoke to them, maybe even ate nearby. He let their fear build. It was part of the process. He changed tactics slightly from victim to victim, tweaking what didn't work, testing boundaries. Some were shot while running, bullet entries in the back. Others were tied to trees and executed at close range. Some had been stabbed in patterns across the torso. In one case, the blade had been twisted. Not a quick kill, a slow bleed. By the time he was caught, police were certain the 7 known victims were just part of the story. Too many missing people, too many shallow graves, too much time unaccounted for. One investigator later said, "It wasn't just murder, it was method, it was ritual." The prosecution wasted no time. They brought out the physical evidence first. Pieces of clothing, camping gear, sleeping bags, cameras, watches, all traced back to victims found in Belanglo. Then came the gun, a Ruger 10-22 semi-automatic rifle, matched ballistics. The same make and model used to shoot at least one of the backpackers. The rifle had been found hidden in a wall cavity at Milat's home, wrapped in a towel, as if he thought the drywall could keep the truth at bay. Next came the testimony. Paul Onions flew back from the UK to face the man who had almost ended his life. He walked into the courtroom, paused, and locked eyes with Milat. The air went still. Everyone leaned in. Paul told the jury about that day in 1990, the roadside pickup, the small talk, the sudden change in mood, and the gun. He described the fear, the sprint through the bush, the sound of shots cracking past his ears, and then he pointed straight at Milat. "That's him. That's the man who tried to kill me." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. The defense tried to punch holes. They argued mistaken identity, said Paul was confused. that the items found in Milat's house had belonged to other family members, that the police had botched the investigation. But the jury wasn't buying it. Too many coincidences, too many connections. The stories didn't change. The patterns were clear. Each victim had been targeted along the same stretch of highway. Each had been restrained. Each had been either shot, stabbed, or both. Many were buried in similar ways, laid out in deliberate poses. Several had items removed post-mortem, trophies, souvenirs, and most damning of all, Milat had no alibi for any of the disappearances. As the days dragged on, the courtroom began to feel more like a gallery. Each new piece of evidence was another brushstroke, painting a portrait of horror. The final blow came when a former girlfriend testified that Milat had once tied her up during sex without warning, that he'd liked control, that he'd talked about hunting, not animals, people. She thought he was joking. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the morning of July 27, 1996, they returned. Guilty. 7 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, 1 count of abduction. Life in prison, no parole, ever. In the days that followed, news outlets ran wall-to-wall coverage. Editorials debated how he'd gone undetected for so long. Former neighbors gave interviews about the nice man next door. Co-workers said he was quiet, reliable, good with tools. His family split. Some defended him to the end, others went silent. But the truth was undeniable now. Ivan MIlat was a killer, one of the worst in Australian history. He was transferred to Goulburn Supermax, the country's highest security prison. Inside, he kept to himself, wrote letters, filed appeals, all denied. He went on hunger strikes, demanded a PlayStation, was denied, cut off his own finger, and mailed it to the High Court to protest his treatment. It didn't work. The justice system didn't blink. What disturbed people most wasn't just the murders, it was the methodical way he carried them out. How he'd scout locations, pick vulnerable targets, manipulate their trust. How he'd toy with them. Some had been kept alive for hours, maybe longer. Restraints found near the bodies suggested prolonged captivity. Gags, blindfolds. One backpacker had been stabbed over 20 times. He didn't kill for money or revenge or impulse. He killed because he wanted to, because he could. And though they only charged him with 7, police believe the real number was higher, much higher. Unsolved cases began to resurface. Disappearances from the 70s and 80s. Missing hikers. Tourists who vanished without a trace. Milat had been working construction then, traveling up and down the coast. Plenty of opportunity, plenty of access, no proof. But suspicion, heavy, hanging suspicion. In his final years, he spoke little, refused to meet with psychologists, rejected confession requests, maintained his innocence until his last breath. In 2019, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, refused chemotherapy, wasted away in a prison hospital bed until on October 27th, he died. No final words, no apology, no answers, just silence. But the story didn't end there, because killers like Milat don't just leave behind bodies. They leave behind echoes, long shadows that stretch through communities and linger in the minds of those who survive. Families still search for closure. Detectives still revisit old case files, wondering what they missed. Tourists still pass that stretch of highway, some unknowingly driving past the exact place where a life was taken. And the forest. The forest is still there, still wide, still silent, still watching, because evil like that doesn't go away. It just waits and hopes you forget. Even after his death, Ivan MIlat's story refused to die. It clung to the headlines, to the whisper of wind in Belanglo, to the unanswered questions that clawed at every investigator's conscience. Because while MIlat was buried in the cold ground of a prison cemetery, the ripples of his actions continued to disturb the surface. People asked if there were more victims. They asked if he acted alone. They asked why men like him seemed to rise again and again from the most ordinary places. Police never closed the books. Not really. MIlat had time, access, and a geographic advantage that made him a person of interest in dozens of unsolved disappearances along the East Coast. Young women, hitchhikers, campers, even children. Some went missing in the 1970s, long before the Belanglo murders. Others vanished in places where MIlat had briefly worked construction or road crews. A pattern formed. Clusters of victims, lone travelers, rural settings, all within reach of where MIlat had been. But there was no physical evidence, no bodies, no confessions, just shadows and suspicion. There was also the question no one wanted to say out loud. Did he have help? Was Ivan MIlat truly acting alone? Some officers believed not. They pointed to the logistics, finding two people, controlling them, dragging bodies over rugged terrain. There were reports of other vehicles seen near abduction sites. Witnesses mentioned more than one voice. Some survivors told of being followed by cars with similar license plates. And then there were his brothers. The MIlat family was large, 12 siblings, most of them boys, many of them hard-edged and tight-lipped. At least 2 had criminal records. One was known to own a gun identical to the murder weapon. Police interrogated the family extensively. They raided homes, questioned alibis, searched for shared involvement. Nothing stuck. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was fear. Maybe Ivan had indeed worked alone. Or maybe someone else buried their secrets just as deep. For criminal psychologists, Ivan MIlat became a case study in control and sadism. He was the template of a textbook predator. Manipulative, cold, organized, patient, but not insane. Never insane. He planned too much, covered his tracks too well. He selected victims with care, foreigners, often far from home, with minimal ties and little means to fight back. He killed in a way that satisfied not just bloodlust, but ego. He wanted to dominate every second, to break them mentally before breaking them physically. The gags, the restraints, the blindfolds, all of it spoke to a man who needed to feel like a god in those last moments. And though MIlat never spoke of his crimes, he didn't have to. The patterns spoke for him. The scene of each body was its own confession. The knife wounds, the bullet trajectories, the careful removal of personal belongings, it all told a story of ritual, of habit. Some experts called it murder as rehearsal, as if each death was a trial run for the next. He didn't change because he never had to. The forest protected him. The isolation gave him time. And society, blind to what walked among it, gave him victims. But MIlat's story didn't end with his death. It echoed. It inspired. In 2010, nearly 2 decades after his arrest, a man named Ivan MIlat, Ivan's great-nephew, lured a schoolmate into Belanglo State Forest. Said they were going to drink, smoke, hang out. Instead, he pulled a double-headed axe from his backpack and murdered the boy while another teen recorded it on a mobile phone. The audio was chilling. Laughter, taunts, the sound of steel on bone, all in the same forest, all under the same name. Matthew was just 17. The victim, David Octoloni, had just turned 17 the day before. There was no argument, no sudden provocation. The murder was planned, premeditated, cold. As they walked deeper into the forest, Matthew had even bragged, telling David, "You're not going to see your family again." Then he struck. One blow, then another, over and over. The recording captured the grotesque rhythm of the attack, punctuated by Matthew's voice mocking and laughing. Later, he told friends he did it to prove himself, to feel powerful, to live up to his last name. During sentencing, the court heard that Matthew had idolized Ivan. He had studied his case obsessively, even visited Belanglo as a child. He'd absorbed the infamy, turned it into mythology. He didn't just share the MIlat name, he embraced the legacy, a lineage of violence. It wasn't just fascination. Investigators found clippings, notes, even sketches among Matthew's belongings, drawings of forest scenes, knives, the word MIlat scrawled in stylized lettering. He once told a classmate he would do something one day to make people remember his name. He viewed Ivan not as a cautionary tale, but as a legend, a dark mentor whose footsteps he longed to follow. Friends described his descent as slow but deliberate, from macabre jokes to morbid fixations. The forest had become sacred to him, a shrine, a testing ground. The judge called the murder brutal beyond comprehension. Matthew MIlat was sentenced to 43 years in prison. His accomplice, who filmed the killing and did nothing to stop it, received a 43-year sentence as well. The media dubbed him the next MIlat. But the truth was even darker. He wasn't the next. He was a continuation, a new chapter written in the same blood-soaked ink. And it didn't stop there. Other killers claimed inspiration from the backpacker murders. A man in Western Australia mimicked the abduction method, using the same ropes, the same car setup. Another left a note referencing MIlat, warning that the ghost of Belanglo lives on. Some were hoaxes, others were real. Either way, Ivan had become more than a man. He had become a myth, and myths are hard to bury. To this day, the forest is marked by warning signs and quiet memorials. Tourists still venture in, sometimes to pay respects, sometimes out of morbid curiosity. Rangers patrol it more closely. Yet the trees remember. The silence is heavy, because long after the last headline fades, Belanglo remains what it always was, a place that swallowed screams and gave back nothing but dirt. Ivan MIlat didn't just kill people. He changed how Australians saw their own country. He exposed a vulnerability in the national character, the belief that evil was something distant, something foreign. He showed that horror could wear work boots, smile politely, and offer you a lift. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all, there was nothing unique about him. There are others. There always have been. Waiting, watching, learning. Because once someone like MIlat shows what's possible, the door opens just a little wider for the next monster to walk through. And if you ever find yourself on a quiet back road, thumbing a ride from a stranger with a kind smile and calloused hands, remember the forest, remember the silence, and ask yourself if the road ahead leads to safety or if it ends in the shadow of Belanglo, where the past isn't dead, it's just buried.